What if saving a stranger in the rain made you the target of ruthless killers and bound your fate to a secret powerful enough to topple empires? When a poor cobbler girl hides a wounded billionaire, she discovers the forbidden truth he carries could destroy them both, or save the world. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more powerful tales like this one. Your support keeps the stories coming. The rain in Brixton didn't fall. It stitched the night together needle-fine, relentless, threading through neon and sirens. Amara had been working late under the awning of her stall, a battered table, with a sewing lamp and a hand-cranked burnisher. She was finishing a risoling oak bark leather that smelled like forest after storm when a man lurched out of the alley across from her. He wore a suit that screamed price and a face that had forgotten how to be sure of anything. He pressed a hand to his side. It came away dark. "Hide me," he rasped. Amara did not like being told what to do, especially by men in suits. But she also had instincts that had kept her alive on nights like this. Behind him, two silhouettes paused at the mouth of the alley, scanning. Their umbrellas made them anonymous, but their posture didn't belong to people out for a stroll. It belonged to people who finished things. Amara lifted the canvas skirt of her stall and jerked her chin. The man dropped, folded himself under the table among shoeboxes and solvent, and went still. She flicked off her lamp. The rain did the rest, a curtain she controlled by doing nothing at all. The silhouettes stepped closer. One of them tapped a cigarette out of a pack, the flame an arrogant dot in the wet. "You seen a tall bloke come through?" he asked, voice flat. "Everyone's tall when you're the one sitting," Amara said. She didn't smile. She never smiled until she meant it. They looked at her tools. The cigarette man exhaled. "We'll be back," he said, which was something. Amateurs promised. Professionals never gave you anything but silence. They vanished down the street. Amara knelt and lifted the skirt again. The man's eyes were open, a pale, electric gray that didn't fit the panic she'd expected. Recognition flickered in her. She'd seen those eyes in useless articles about net worth and genius and private islands. Adrian Vale, the tech billionaire who thought the future should be clean and frictionless, and his. He was the face that had stared at her from posters when his company redeveloped half the high street. Her father's old shop had fallen to that progress. The compensation had been the kind of joke no one laughed at. She let the recognition settle without telling. "Him. You're bleeding," she said. "It's not deep," he said, voice steadier. "I need a minute, then I'm gone." "Fine by me," she said. "But if you faint, you'll crush my work." He coughed a breath that might have been a laugh. She slid out a tin, unscrewed it mink oil, and handed him a rag. "Press that. Don't stain the leather." "Are you always like this?" he asked, busy. She leaned back onto her stool, turned her lamp at half, and resumed stitching, her curved needle catching, pulling, catching. The thread whispered through with a soothing inevitability. It calmed customers. It calmed her. "What do I call you?" he asked from the dark. "Amara," she said. "Thank you, Amara." A strange, formal gratitude, like he was used to speaking. To rooms that recorded him, blue strobes flashed at the far end of the road, refracting off puddles. Not police something private. Wrong shade, wrong rhythm. Amara's stomach tightened. She had learned to read danger not in the facts, but in the cadence. "Why are they after you?" she asked. Adrian was silent long enough that she wondered if he'd passed out. Then, "Because I didn't do what I was told. Because I found a thing I wasn't meant to find." "Specific," she said dryly. He shifted. A silver cufflink skittered out from under the table and clicked against her shoe. She picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been, engraved, with a pattern so delicate It felt almost alive, a honeycomb, threaded with lightning. She went to hand it back, and in doing so, her thumb found a seam that didn't belong. The cufflink had a hinge. Inside, no bigger than a fingernail, a wafer blinked the way a heartbeat would blink if it were made of light. She closed it before he could see her curiosity. "You dropped your pretty." He tucked it away, eyes locking on hers too much like. "A dare. That's not pretty. That's my life." Amara's lamp hummed. She tied off a stitch and thought about when to tell him that she didn't help men because they were famous, or because she was bored, or because she believed in random kindness. She helped because the world took what it wanted in broad daylight and called it progress, and sometimes a person had to say no in the rain where nobody expected it. Footsteps returned. Not 2, 4. The men didn't bother to hide their conversation this time. "Boss says he's close. Check the stalls." Amara's jaw tightened. She flicked her awl to her left hand, the handle worn to the exact shape of her own grip. "You wouldn't survive under there if they decided to overturn the table?" she said softly. "What would you suggest?" Adrian's voice was almost curious, like he was taking notes for a later world in which danger could be debugged. "Be someone else for 5 minutes," she said. "And trust me." She unrolled a leather apron, smeared a line of dye on his cheekbones, ran her fingers through his hair until it fell wrong. She pulled him out and sat him on the stool. He winced but cooperated. "Don't speak," she said. "Let me." The men approached. "Evening," Amara called first, claiming the territory with her voice. "Can I fix something for you?" "Your solace looked tired." They blinked at Adrian, who now looked like a man who belonged to the night shift and to his hands. People saw what they thought they knew. Amara had learned to let them. "Where'd your customer go?" Cigarette Man asked. The smoke was no. An umbrella of smell. "You're looking at him," she said. "He needed a quick polish. Big date, you know. Some men don't plan, and then they make their emergencies my problem." One of them smirked, glancing at Adrian's scuffed shoes. "Posh boy, are you?" Adrian shrugged like a man whose dignity had been rationed long ago. The gesture was good acting or a well of truth. "Maybe both." "Move," the other said, reaching to flip her table skirt. Amara stood, tall enough that the lamp made a halo on her braids. "No, don't touch my work." The man's hand paused. Power recognized power even when it didn't expect to find it under a leaky awning. The rain's pressure increased, drumming a verdict on plastic and tin. Cigarette Man flicked ash. "Waste of time," he muttered. They moved on. Amara exhaled in a long thread. She put her hand on the stool's back. 5 minutes are up." She said, "You're leaving." He stood carefully. "I owe you." "You owe me nothing," she said, even as the cufflink's weight seemed to drag gravity toward them. "But you're going to owe someone if you keep bleeding on my mat." "There's a clinic near Acre Lane." "No clinics," he said quickly. "Then you need somewhere else." She looked at the alley where danger had shape and at the cufflink where danger had data. "I know a place that leaks less than this." He nodded. The rain stitched them together again, and they moved. Behind them, under the table, a droplet worked its way down a length of thread and pooled against the imprint. Of a cufflink's pattern it had pressed into leather honeycomb and lightning, an omen waiting in the dark. Amara's aunt kept a flat above a Pentecostal church, and the choir practiced on Tuesdays with a fervor that made the walls friendly to secrets. She ushered Adrian up the narrow stairs, past a hand-painted sign that said "All Things Mend," and into a kitchen that smelled of pepper soup and polish. Auntie Ngozi wasn't home. Amara found a clean towel, boiled water, laid out her kit. She had learned first aid in the way you learned everything at the market, by watching closely, then doing when it mattered. "Shirt," she said. He unbuttoned, flinching when fabric peeled away from the wound. A graze along the ribs, ugly but not fatal. She cleaned it with tender ruthlessness, bandaged with strips she'd cut from a sacrificial t-shirt. "You've done this before," he said. "I've done everything before," she said, and then softer, "at least once." She didn't explain about her father's hands, steadying hers while he taught her to stitch leather and skin with the same love for edges aligning. She didn't explain funerals or the demolition notice posted crookedly on their shop door, or how long a person could feel angry without believing it would ever be called by its true name. "What did you find?" she asked, because she didn't help people for mystery's sake. She helped, and then she required something like truth, or else the stitch would not hold. Adrian pulled the cufflink from the pocket where he kept it like prayer. He pressed the seam and revealed the wafer again, light beating faint as if tired. "This is a ledger," he said. "Hidden books. Transfers routed through a charity that doesn't build schools so much as it buys silence." It was meant to be a proof of concept for fraud detection. Ironies abound, but someone used it to model a perfect crime, and then built the crime around the model. I shouldn't have had access, but I did. Now I don't have anything else. "Who wants it back?" she asked. "My CFO, Fenlo, and anyone who owes him favors. He told me to leave it alone. I did not. Now the board has concerns about my leadership. They froze me out, locked my accounts, and set the wolves loose." He glanced at the crucifix above the door, as if remembering the world had frameworks for guilt. "I'm sorry," he added. Out of nowhere. For what? She didn't let him apologize for his existence. If he was going to be sorry, he needed to choose a thing for the shops we demolished. "I read reports. I made decisions. I told myself we compensated the affected. We didn't compensate you." Her pulse did a strange skipping. She hadn't told him. Brixton had told him. The rain had told him. The way her hands had refused to shake had told him. She waited for the heat of old anger to flare, but what came was colder and more dangerous. Clarity. "You're not the first rich man to discover the floor has consequences," she said. "If you're honest, there'll be time to be sorry later. Right now, I need to know how bad this gets." "Bad," he said simply. "Those men tonight weren't performative. They're outsourced decisiveness." "Then you can't go." "Home," she said. "You can't go anywhere predictable. And you can't carry that thing where anyone can pat you down." He looked at the wafer. "Where else would I put it?" Amara walked to the cupboard where she kept her father's old shoes, the ones she could never sell because they carried the shape of his grief and his jokes and the way he hammered nails like they'd wronged him personally. She took down a scuffed boot, flipped it over, and slid free the insole. A hidden pocket waited where her father had once stashed tiny things no one else needed to know about. "Here," she said, "and then we'll sew the pocket shut." She looked up at him. "I don't like your world, Mr. Vale, but scene work I understand." He passed her the wafer as if passing a confession. She settled it into the pocket, set the insole back. She stitched with speed and exactness, closing the knowledge like a secret told to a trustworthy friend. When she finished, she pressed the boot into his hands. "Walk softer. It listens." "Will they stop looking if they think I don't have?" "Eat?" he asked. "They'll look until looking is more dangerous than not," she said. "So let's make it dangerous." He tilted his head. "You have a plan." "I have anger that knows how to count," she said. "And a cousin who owes me favors because I fixed his entire Sunday suit situation for free." Kofi arrived 20 minutes later, out of breath and smiling the smile of someone who found adrenaline delicious. "Amara," he said, hugging her, with the energy of a weather system. "You never call until it's interesting." Adrian watched Kofi with a look Amara recognized. He was measuring the geometry of trust. Rich boy in trouble? Kofi guessed, and gagged dramatic at the blood. Yikes. By the way, 3 meat umbrellas are staking the street downstairs. You've got fans. Decoys, Amara said. And a prosthetic. She pulled out a battered briefcase, filled it with old phones, a dead laptop, fake cufflinks, and a brick for weight. They want a box to chase. Let's give them a box. And the real treasure? Kofi asked. Amara tapped. The heel of Adrian's boot. Underfoot. Kofi whistled. Admiration clean. Girl, you are Chaos' favorite niece. They move at midnight. Choir practice had ended. The church was a sleeping giant that snored peace. Kofi took the briefcase and swaggered down the steps. Like sin on payday, the umbrellas followed. Amara waited 5 minutes and took Adrian the other way, through the back fire exit that stuck when it rained, down an alley that gave up rubbish midstream. They crossed under the railway where the trains thundered like impatient gods. Adrian matched her speed without complaint. If we get out of this, he said, wrongly using the if like it wasn't already bleeding, what then? Then you. Tell someone with power to make arrests, she said. They're compromised, he said. Then we use a different power. She glanced at the city like it might answer in lights. Truth, loud. So loud even rich men can't afford to muffle. A shadow peeled off from a doorway ahead. A man stepped into their path, not umbrellaed, rain outlining him with silver. He smiled in a way that said he knew what he had and what they didn't. You were supposed to trust Kofi, he said amiably. But it's cute that you made a second plan inside the first. Adrian stopped. Fenlo? The man inclined his head clean as a bow. I hear you've been keeping souvenirs, Adrian. Amara's hand found her all in her coat pocket. She felt the handle's familiar groove. She also felt, cold and real, the understanding that her anger had walked them into the sightline of a man who preferred solutions that stayed solved. Let's keep this tidy, Fenlo said softly as more shadows unstitched themselves from the night. Give me the ledger. Walk away, or don't. The music from the church drifted faint through the damp and aftersound of faith. Amara made a choice in that echo, not just to save a man, but to cut a thread that had been strangling her family since the redevelopment. She took a half-step forward, rain bright on her braids, and smiled the smile she reserved for people who underestimated craftspeople. You want what's under our feet, she said. You'll have to step on us to get it. Fenlo's eyes lit with a hunter's patience. That can be arranged. The night held its breath. Somewhere, the city began to choose sides. They ran not the panicked run of prey, but the disciplined sprint of people who decided speed could be a weapon. Amara yanked Adrian down a side street, through a gate whose rust had learned her hand, and into a courtyard where a mural of a black girl with a crown of bicycles watched the world with learned amusement. Fenlo's men pounded after them, heavy-footed. Amara vaulted a low wall. Adrian followed, less gracefully, but with the terrifying competence of someone who had spent his life mastering systems and decided his body was the newest system. They burst into a closed laundrette. Amara knew the owner, knew where the spare key lived, in a sock behind the counter. She grabbed it, locked the door, dragged a folding table against it. The machines, dormant, stood like patient drums. Adrian leaned against a washer, breath steadying. He knows Kofi, he said. Accusation tucked carefully away from Amara, but close enough to sting. Kofi loves money more than he loves being right, she said, pain like a pebble in her shoe. It makes him predictable, which is a kind of safety until it isn't. You trust me? He asked. I trust what you've shown me, she said. Sometimes that's enough. A thud hit the door. Another. Fenlo's voice murmured through the rain hum. You don't have long. Adrian's gaze darted to the machines, to the vents, to the ceiling tiles, gone soft at the edges. He crossed to the back, found the maintenance. "Hatch, this goes to the service corridor," he said, as if the world's innards were politely labeled for him. "We can make the street 2 blocks down." "Then we do," Amara said, and took the lead. They emerged into a lane where Fox considered them, nose lifted as if cataloging their sins. Amara's phone buzzed. A message from Auntie. "You Safi?" A kind of text that made you feel anchored to a planet you weren't always sure welcomed you. Amara typed back, "With a friend. Be back late." The word friend surprised her. She let it stand. They didn't stop until they reached a tiny cafe that knew how to be open at unreasonable hours. Steam fogged the windows, and the owner, Mr. Patel, had the kind of memory that forgot faces when forgetting was kindness. Amara ordered chai heavy with ginger. Adrian wrapped his hands around the heat and watched the street the way men watch. "Markets, waiting for a move. We can't keep running," he said. "No," Amara agreed. "We need to set the stitch." He looked at her, one corner of his mouth curving. "Explain." "You make a stitch to hold 2 pieces. If the tension is wrong, it tears. If the thread's weak, it frays. If you place it where the leather flexes, it fails. You plan placement, tension, reinforcement. Then even pressure becomes safety." "You've thought about this," he said. "I think about everything," she said, and then pointed with her chin at his boot. "We have truth sewn where nobody would expect. We need to pull that thread through eyes that matter, eyes that can't pretend not to see." He nodded slowly. "There's a journalist," he said. "Roxanne Lee. Investigative. She hates me on principle, which I respect. But she loves receipts. If we get this to her, she'll make it loud." "Where?" Amara asked. "She's speaking." "At a charity gala tomorrow," he said. "At the Shard." Amara barked a laugh. "Of course she is. And who's hosting the gala?" "Fenlo," he said, grim. "Because even villains like applause for their masks." "You can get in?" Amara asked. "They rescinded my invitation," he said, and then a wolfish glimmer lit his eyes. "But buildings have kitchens. Kitchens have staff. Staff have shoes. And you, Amara, have a trade nobody notices until their heel snaps." "Now you're speaking my language," she said. "We go in as staff. We go out as fire." She texted a number she kept for emergencies she didn't like naming. The reply came fast. An address, a time, a name to whisper at a loading dock. She finished her chai like a benediction and stood. "Wait," Adrian said. "Before we walk into the lion's jaws, you should know the redevelopment of your block. It was pushed by Fenlo. He sold me a dream of optimizing neighborhoods. Broke it into KP, is so clean I couldn't smell the blood. I signed it. I own it, but the pressure came from him. Does that make you less guilty?" She kept her tone even. "No," he said. "It makes me more determined." That answer was not absolution, but it was something solid, a stitch in the right place. They parted to sleep, Amara at Auntie's, Adrian at a hostel where anonymity was a currency, and met the next evening. In shadows near the service entrance of a building so glassy it seemed embarrassed by weather. Amara wore black, hair coiled tight, apron rolled. Adrian wore the posture of a man who had worked backstage all his life and did not plan to be seen now. The loading dock buzzed. Staff shouted. Pallets rolled. No one looked at them twice. Inside, the kitchen, heat and motion, married like old lovers. Amara's eyes scanned the room. Shoes told stories. The sous chef with gaffer tape gripped around his left trainer. The server whose heel had been superglued and prayed over. The manager whose Oxfords were new and pinched. She set up her kit next to the ice machine. Free. Emergency repairs, she called, as if she'd been sanctioned to exist. Within minutes she had a queue. and in the queue came proximity, and with proximity came access. Adrian slipped through doorways like a rumor. He knew how to look like he belonged, only because he'd spent so many years in rooms where everyone knew his name. Not being seen was a learned rebellion. He found a service corridor that led to the ballroom mezzanine and clocked exits, cameras, choke points. He mapped it in his head, lines and nodes, as if the building were software that would obey him if he humored it. He returned to Amara with a waiter's jacket and a question. "You ready?" She held up a repaired heel. "Always." They moved toward the ballroom's edge, where lights fell like applause, and Roxanne Lee stood rehearsing remarks. Severe and brilliant, her hair a geometry of intention. Fenlo worked the room like a benefactor, men gravitating toward him with smiles that tried too hard. Amara's heart beat not from fear, but from the justice of it. The rightness that came when you knew a pattern, and finally had the thread that would unnake it. She touched the heel of Adrian's boot. Inside, the ledger waited, quiet, perfect, devastating. "Time to pull," she whispered, and the pattern began to loosen. The gala was a cathedral of glass and money, the kind of room where sound had velvet manners. On stage, a quartet laid down music polite enough to sell you a sin. Fenlo's speech unfurled smooth as ribbon, all about children and futures and the noble duty of the fortunate. People clapped with practiced moderation, careful not to disturb their own illusions. Amara and Adrian moved along the periphery, ghosts in black carrying trays. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Get close to Roxanne, get her the ledger, get out. Simplicity made room for chaos. Chaos arrived dressed as security. ID, a guard said to Adrian, palm up, eyes bored. Bored guards were the most dangerous alertness. Could be fooled. Boredom had no patience for narrative. Adrian handed over a borrowed badge. The guard scanned it, frowned slightly. Adrian's pulse did not change. He had learned long ago that systems trusted the unflappable. The scanner chirped green. The guard handed it back without an apology. Amara exhaled and let her mind return. To the stitch. She had eyes on Roxanne, now short stage left, conferring with a woman whose earpiece screamed competence. Amara threaded her way toward her, as if responding to a hand signal. She arrived with the grace of staff, the anonymity. "Of service, Ms. Lee?" she said softly. Roxanne looked up, eyes sharp. "Yes?" "I have something you'll want," Amara murmured. "It's loud. It's real." Roxanne's face did something nuanced, skepticism allowing exactly a breath's worth of curiosity. "You have 12 seconds. In the heel of my colleagues." Boot is a ledger of offshore transfers routed through Fenlo's charity. Names, dates, sums. If we leave now, I'll give it to you outside, somewhere that won't be curated. Amara held her gaze. If we don't leave now, we may never speak. Roxanne's skepticism performed a quick autopsy on Amara's tone and posture, and the sweat at her hairline, and the bitter humor in her eyes. It found no death, only urgency. "Meet me in 7 minutes," Roxanne said. "Staff exit B. If I'm not there by 8, run and don't stop." Amara nodded once. "Copy." She relayed the rendezvous to Adrian in a whisper slick as oil. He nodded, and together they bent their path toward the exit. They almost made it. Almost is a word shaped like a trap. Leaving so soon? Fenlo asked, stepping into the corridor as if he'd been conjured by misfortune. He had a smile that made Amara think of knives being cleaned. Back to the kitchen. Adrian said, effortless, the lie practiced on airplanes and in interviews. Fenlo tilted his head. "You were always a poor liar, brilliant at invention, catastrophic at deceit. It's why I kept you visible and kept the real machinery where you couldn't touch it." His gaze dropped, almost idly, to Adrian's boots. "It's endearing." You chose somewhere sentimental. Amara's skin chilled. He knew where the ledger lived. Of course he did. Villains learned to read the people who opposed them. It was their hobby. Fenlo signaled. Security stepped closer, closing like a stitch meant to suffocate. Alarms were not yet possible. He wanted this quiet. Walk with us, he said. We'll collect what isn't yours, and then who knows? Maybe tonight ends in a press release about your leave of absence becoming permanent. Tragic, but tasteful. Adrian looked at Amara. Questions burned that couldn't be asked here. She shook her head once. No surrender. Then she did something that no model of risk would have predicted. She tripped. It was a controlled fall. Body collapsing into security's path, tray flying. Champagne arced like comet tails and shattered at their feet. Reflex made men flinch. In that hiccup, Adrian moved. He pivoted, foot snapping back, heel striking the skirting board of the corridor, exactly where Amara had noticed, earlier, a maintenance panel with a loose bracket. The panel popped. A snarl of cables revealed itself like a flayed vein. Adrian kicked again. Lights in the corridor died for one delicious second. In the dark, Amara's awl found a wrist and convinced it to open. Adrian vanished through the maintenance gap, dragging Amara behind him. They fell into a waist-high crawlspace that smelled like dust and secrets. Shouts banged against the walls. A flashlight beam stabbed the dark. Amara and Adrian belly crawled, like contraband, following the cable's direction into the building's nervous system. The passage opened into a service stairwell. They tumbled down 2 flights, burst into a corridor, and shouldered through a door marked B. Roxanne was there. She'd chosen flat shoes for a gala, which told Amara everything she needed to know about her character. You're late, Roxanne said, and then, do you have it? Adrian lifted his foot onto a bench, yanked off the boot, and worked the shoe. Insole-free, with fingers that shook for the first time. He passed the wafer to Roxanne as if handing over a soul. Roxanne palmed it, slid it into a lead-lined pouch she must have carried for days like this. If I'm about to be murdered, she said conversationally, this will be uploaded to enough places that murder will feel like a networking event. Good, Amara said. Roxanne's gaze flicked to the corridor. You have to go. Now. I'll buy you 40 seconds. How? Adrian asked. Roxanne stepped back into the ballroom with the air of a woman ready to pull fire alarms with her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, she said into a live mic that suddenly belonged to her. Before you donate another £1, I have a few questions about where your money actually goes. The room stiffened. Fenlo's face did something ugly. Security hesitated because optics had entered the chat. Amara and Adrian ran. The staff exit coughed them into cold air. They took alleys the way blood takes capillaries blind, but purposeful. Sirens woke at a distance, the city clearing its throat before screaming by the time they reached the river. Their triumph had already become fragile. Adrian's phone buzzed from a number only 3 people knew. He answered. A voice like ice. Sighed, Careful, Adrian. You've made the story interesting. Now we'll make you irrelevant. Fenlo? Adrian asked, though he knew. You think you've won because a journalist loves a receipt? Fenlo mused. My dear boy, people don't believe facts. They believe feelings. Your reputation is a mood I can change. The line clicked dead. The bridge groaned under trucks. Amara leaned on the balustrade and watched the black water fold over itself. You all right? Adrian asked. No, she said. That's not the point, are you? He laughed, and it sounded like a man hearing his own heartbeat after thinking it had left him. Ask me tomorrow. Tomorrow, she repeated, tasting it. She thought about the block where her father's shop had stood, the community that had been displaced like furniture. She thought about this man next to her, who had signed the paper that made it happen and had come here with her anyway to unmake another harm. She let the paradox live. People were patterns. Some could be Risun. A message pinged on her phone from Roxanne. Got enough to start. Keep breathing. Stay dark. Stay dark, Amara murmured. That we can do. The last lace had been pulled. Now came the moment when a shoe either held or came apart under pressure. They turned from the river. Two figures in the night the city pretended not to see, and walked into a tomorrow no one had engineered yet. Morning arrived stubbornly. Headlines began to flicker, not yet front page, but persistent Roxanne's work seeding into the system like dye into leather. Words like embezzlement and charity fraud and board complicity threaded across screens. Fenlo smiled on television and called the allegations misunderstandings. He looked unbothered, because men like him had been given so much practice at being unbothered, they'd turned it into a skill. Amara didn't watch TV. She repaired a pair of boots for a woman who worked double shifts at the hospital and needed her saws to bless her more than her bosses did. The familiar rhythm steadied her, the awl, the thread, the little ritual with the wax. She could make a thing better. It was not a small power dot. Adrian showed up at noon with sleep in his eyes and resolve in his jaw. He wore trainers and a hoodie that made him look younger or honest. She wasn't sure which. He handed her a paper bag. Inside, a saltfish patty. From the shop that knew her name and her appetite, and ginger beer, the good kind. For your trouble, he said, and then, for your life. She took the patty and bit into gratitude hot enough to burn. What now? She asked around a mouthful. Now we do something I should have done years ago, he said. We sue my own company. We petition for a forensic audit. We force a government inquiry. And I give a statement that makes me very suable and perhaps very unemployed. Fun, she said dry. You'll need to not die while doing that. He nodded. I have security that isn't hired out of wet alleyways with umbrellas. Then his mouth softened. Amara, I want you to be safe. Fenlo knows your face now. I've had my face for years, she said. It's done worse things. To worse men. She looked at the street, at the way the rain had washed yesterday, clean enough to ride on again. Besides, I'm not leaving home. He hesitated, then took a breath you take when you're about to tell the truth and let it land. Your father's shop, he said. There's a fund for restorative development reel, not the PR kind. If you agree, I'll put resources there, not to own, to repair. A training workshop, apprenticeships, lease protections. You and Auntie decide the terms. I'll sign what you write. She set down her awl. That was not an apology. It was better. It was the transfer of power. You'll be hated by men like you, she said. I already am, he said. I'd rather be hated for a different reason now. She studied him, not with romance, not yet, but with the attention you give a piece of leather. You're deciding whether to salvage or scrap. There were stress lines. There was softness where it should be hard, but there was integrity in the graying. Okay, she said. Then, because the world could still be kind when no one was watching. Good. They walked that afternoon to where the block had been and stood where a convenience store now sold energy drinks to teenagers with infinite hair. Amara closed her eyes and saw the ghost door, her father's sign with letters that leaned because the ladder had been borrowed. She measured the pavement with her feet and said, Here. Adrian nodded, and they took pictures at angles that suggested ownership, even where none existed yet. Ownership lived in the mind first, then in the ink. She intended to own the terms of her own story now. Fenlo was arrested 2 days later, not for charity fraud, not yet, but for witness intimidation. He had sent the wrong text to the right undercover officer. That was how change often arrived, not as a trumpet, but as an idiot mistake made by a man who had never believed consequences could be bespoke for him. Roxane's series began to publish that night. It was not just receipts. It was narrative that braided numbers into meaning, and meaning into fury. The board splintered into factions that sued one another with the desperation of children, grabbing toys while the house burned. Adrian gave his statement. It was less brave than some believed, more brave than he felt. He did not center himself. He said names. He clarified verbs. He looked into the camera and said, "I was wrong," then said it again, and didn't turn it into a parable about growth. He answered questions as if humility were a muscle you could use before it atrophied forever. Threats came, and lawyers, and invitations to flee to somewhere that sold sunsets to the guilty. Adrian stayed. He moved into a flat, so small he could hear his neighbor's kettle, and found comfort in the proof that other people needed tea at the exact times he did. He came to Amara's stall each day not to declare devotion, but to learn. She taught him how to cut a sole, how to feel the difference between leather that would last and leather that would spite you. He bled once on a stitch and didn't complain. She held his finger under cold water and said, "Welcome to the part of the world where your hands tell the truth." They did not so much fall in love as assemble it carefully, checking tension, trimming thread, measuring knot, because they feared failure, but because they respected craft. He told her stories about machines that learned. She told him about things that never should. He learned to stand between her and men who mistook her for service when she was, in fact, sovereignty. She learned to let someone else sometimes take the weight without thinking it theft. On the day the lease for the training workshop was signed, Auntie Ngozi cried with a joy that made Amara pretend she was only allergic to dust. They named the space All Things Mend, because to change the sign would be to unthread a lineage too precious to risk. The first apprentices arrived with hands eager to be useful and eyes that had weathered storms. They learned to stitch. They learned to price their time. They learned to say no without apologizing their way into yes. Months later, as spring made a tentative promise on a Friday afternoon, Amara locked the workshop and stood with Adrian under a sky that had decided blue. Wasn't a betrayal. He held out something small, nervous. "Don't," she said automatically, because a proposal ring in a street where her father's shop had died felt like a narrative that wanted to colonize her choices. "It's not that," he said, smile crooked. "Well, not yet. It's here." He opened his palm. A cufflink, silver, engraved with a new pattern. Not honeycomb and lightning, but a needle threading a curve into a heart that looked like a shoe last if you knew how to see. "For me?" she asked, eyebrow winging. "For us," he said. "Not." A contract, a reminder of what held when it should have broken. She took it, felt its weight. "Careful," she said, teasing to soften the way her chest hurt with hope. "If I sew this into my boot, you'll be stuck with me forever." "I can imagine worse fates," he said lightly, though his eyes were serious. "Good," she said, and let herself kiss him then, not for the newspaper version of their story, but for the private one that had been complicated and stubborn and stitched by hand. Somewhere across the city, a man who had once thought himself permanent stared at a cell wall and wondered how a girl with an awl and a rain-leaking stall had unmade a machine built by men with yachts. The answer was boring. Craft, patience, rage that learned to count, a ledger underfoot, and love that took its time. The rain began, not hard, not stitching now, but blessing. Amara lifted her face to it. "All things mend," she said. "Given enough skill," Adrian agreed, "and enough thread," she said. They walked, and the sound their steps made was the small music of a world repaired to the extent that two people could repair it, which was not everything, but was, this evening, more than nothing. and that felt like a future worth keeping.